Okay, so Ben Phillips is the author of How to Fight Inequality. It came out, I think, 3 months ago, 4 months ago. Read it. I have not finished it, but it's amazing. And instead, it has a lot of data, but it also tells incredibly compelling stories about the power of people to organize and advocate and actually affect change. So we'll put the link in the chat. If you haven't heard of it, read it, follow Ben on all of his channels. He advises the United Nations, governments, civil society organizations across the world. And if his roles range anything from NGO director, political advisor, civil society activist, and writer on almost every continent, I don't think including Antarctica, so you can correct us on that, Ben, but maybe. He began his development work at the grassroots as a teacher and ANC activist living in a township in South Africa in 1994, just after the end of apartheid. He has led programs and campaign teams at Oxfam, ActionAid, Save the Children, the Children's Society, the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, the Global Campaign for Education, and co-founded the Fight Inequality Alliance, which he'll tell you about, but it actually is really interesting. At Davos, the World Economic Forum, instead of being a fringe issue, now the global elites are actually talking about inequality. We'll see what they're actually doing. He's been a Hewlett Fellow at the Public Policy Institute at the Kellogg, Hewlett Fellow of Public Policy at the Kellogg Institute at Notre Dame, Resident Fellow Inequality at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center, which is incredibly beautiful. You can ask him about that. And a guest lecturer on global inequality at Cambridge University and many other places. And he's a frequent writer and appears often on television, Financial Times, New Internationalist, Reuters, CNN, Al Jazeera, and the BBC. And we'll put his Twitter handle because he's a fellow Twitter compatriot. So like most of our career chats, I will turn it over to Ben. He will share some insights and some stories for a while, and then we will open up 100% for your questions, comments, and interactive discussion. And you can start putting in your questions at any point. And if you want to share something longer, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you in the order in which you raised your hand. So thank you so much, Ben, for taking time from your beautiful location in Italy, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Craig. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be with you and Catalina. Thank you for having me. And it's great to get to know all of you. I'm really looking forward to a conversation. I mean, one of the kind of theses in my book is that change is built together. So I couldn't argue that in the book and then have a session where it's just me talking. So I'm just going to share a little bit just so that people know enough about the book, just to kick off conversation. But I'm really, really keen to hear from you. So I just wrote this, How to Fight Inequality and Why That Fight Needs You. Why did I write it? I started thinking about writing it because I was puzzled by a paradox of success and failure. I had been working on inequality for a long time. My roots really were working on poverty. That was what drove me morally. But quite quickly, I reached the conclusion that that couldn't be resolved unless we tackled inequality. And it's been interesting getting to know people who've come from other origins, for example, from the climate movement, who've reached similar conclusions, or people working on democracy, or people working on peace, who've reached similar conclusions that unless you tackle inequality, all these other issues will never be resolved. So inequality had been kind of my obsession. And I was really keen that governments and the mainstream discourse would stop telling me I was crazy when I said three things. And those three things were: inequality is rising pretty much across the world. Inequality is harmful, it's damaging, it's bad. It's not just me being jealous of Elon Musk's boat or something. I mean, it's bad. And the third is that government needs to do something about it. So these were the three things that I would say. And polite critics, would call me a communist, and less polite critics would want to put my friends away in some kind of jail. Now, then something strange happened, which was they started saying, I agree. And this is often a moment of elation. And what I discovered, in fact, is that actually this is a moment of deep jeopardy. There's nothing more dangerous that your advocacy target can ever say to you than, yes, I agree. So they said, yes, we agree. And now those three things I said, which was inequality is rising, inequality is harmful, and governments need to step in and do something about it, you now can't get past page 2 of a World Bank report without coming across those lines. I wish that I'd copyrighted them, because then under intellectual property regime, I would be a millionaire. But I didn't, because at the time I started saying them, it was still seen as outlandish. Now, here's the strange thing in a way. Not that we won the debate. I mean, I'm glad we did, and the evidence was all on our side, but that nothing really happened. When I say nothing really happened, I mean this paradox. Every single country in the world has now pledged to tackle inequality. So I'm not just talking about, the IMF now talks about it, mainstream academia now talks about it, the number of books being generated on inequality has gone up 5 times. I'm not just talking about that. I'm saying governments promised in black and white to reduce it, where in 2015, September, every single one of them signed. It's damn hard to get every single government to sign anything. Every single government signed in 2015, September, the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 10 says this: we pledge to reduce inequality within and between countries. That is very radical. They did not want to say that. They refused to say it in 2000 with the Millennium Development Goals. And when the high-level panel, which was the drafting group for the Sustainable Development Goals, came out with the draft, they did not include anything about reducing inequality. And lots of people got cross. I got cross and told them off. And my boss got a phone call from the British government saying, "Who's Ben Phillips and how will you silence him?" So they didn't want to move that way. They did in the end move that way. So it was really bold. But then they've now pledged, every single one of them. So what's happened since? This is the strange thing. Try to say out loud every single government that's pledged to reduce inequality. It's about 190 countries. You'll run out of breath. Nobody can do it without taking a pause. Now, count with your fingers the number of countries that are substantially, transformatively reducing inequality. And you have fingers left to spare, even if you only use one hand. That's the paradox I'm talking about, that they pledged to do it. We won the debate, but we didn't get the action. So I was kind of puzzled by this paradox. And I wondered what on earth that I devoted all this time to fighting this debate, rather than the something that would actually bring change. So it took me on this journey of saying, well, why don't I investigate when has inequality been beaten before? So I'll look at success. I'll say, when has inequality been beaten before? And then I'll ask, what did they do? Now, when I looked at what did they do, I was less interested in the particular policy mix. We can talk about the policy mix. The policy mix is not simple. In other words, there's no single one policy that reduces inequality, but it's not that complicated. So if you look at the things that the Lula government did in Brazil, and they didn't go far enough, but if you look at the things that they did, where, for example, they put money in the hands of people through Bolsa Familia, that's part of it, but never enough. So there's people that tell you that basic income grant or whatever is the answer. They're not correct. Not because there's anything wrong with basic income grant, just because there is no policy, however good, that does it on its own. Putting money in the hands of ordinary people, that's a good thing to do. That's part of the mix. Raising wages and strengthening rights at work, that's part of the mix. Redistributing land is part of the mix, especially if you're in a rural type economy. Tackling historical discrimination against women and ethnic minorities, that is part of the mix. Having a progressive taxation system. Progressive taxation system basically means you try and take the lever off VAT or consumption taxes. So you try and have some things that are exempt, like food and fuel and books and things like that. And then you try and put the pressure on higher rates of income tax for people who've got more. A lot of countries have no higher rate of income tax. What I mean by that is, if you take Kenya, for example, a school teacher and an oligarch pay the same tax rate. The same highest income tax rate is the rate that teachers pay. So there is no rich people rate. And in fact, that top rate in Kenya just got reduced with the excuse of the COVID pandemic. The worst kind of policy action to do in such a. So instead, you want to actually have higher taxes on the rich, and you want to tax wealth. And only a small number of countries do that. Argentina's just started doing it again. Bolivia's just started doing it again. Some progress made on that, but that's some of the mix. And there's other things too. But the basic story is, you could hire a consultant or a smart person to work with you for a week who'd give you most of the policy mix. The interesting thing for me was, what is the social conditions that lead to that happening? So here's what I found. It was never a self-correction of the market. It was always an action by the government. What led to the action by the government? Well, it was never just decision makers were given evidence and then they acted. I sat with a group of really super intellectual economists, really super. They were talking things I didn't understand. They were using Greek letters. You know, when you're in one of those meetings, literally using Greek letters. And anyway, they were doing all this thing. And I put up my hand and I said to this eminent group, I said, I've just got a question. I'm just trying to understand what it is that we're doing. I think what we're doing is this. Just tell me if I'm right. What we're doing is we are analyzing why is inequality bad and what is the policy mix to tackle it. And then we're going to present that evidence to governments so that they address it. Is that correct? Have I summed it up correctly? Everyone was like, yeah, of course, that's what we're doing. Strange question. I said, okay, can someone tell me an example of when, because a group of intellectuals, policy experts did that exercise and presented it to government, can someone give me an example of where that led to a transformative change in reducing inequality? And there was kind of quiet. And I said, it doesn't have to be recent. I mean, it could be, you know, last 150 years, it could be any continent, just one place. And silence, and then laughter. And people realized, of course, that isn't how change happens. It's never, ever that way. It was never from heroic savior leaders. There's some stories that we learn. If you take, for example, figures like FDR or JFK or LBJ in the States, sometimes it is ascribed to them, what they did in terms of tackling inequality. When I went back and looked at the history, though, you always had pressure from below. And you have some interesting kind of Venn diagrams of who that pressure is. So in the US, for example, and we see this pattern played out in a number of places, you see trade union pressure, very, very important. Trade unions were much stronger in the US at the time when inequality was being reduced. You also see activist movements, whether they are feminist movements or peace movements or whatever it is, but other kind of organized activist movements. And particularly in the US, you also see in this Venn diagram Black-led movements. And they act together in concert. And there's a guy called A. Philip Randolph, who was a Black trade union activist. So he's very much in the center of that Venn diagram. And he had to threaten to call out a march to FDR and to Kennedy and Johnson. So he stretched across that whole period. And if it hadn't been for that type of organizing pressure, we wouldn't have seen the radical steps that governments took to reduce inequality. So it's not a story of savior leaders. And interestingly, in the US case, you find that those policies that reduced inequality were continued to be enacted by Republican presidents in that period of 50s and 60s. And yet when you get to the 90s, you find that even Democrats won't. Now this switch where, if you like, in the 1950s and 60s, the center left and center right, when in government, will reduce inequality, whereas in the 90s, neither the center left nor the center right will. So in other words, you could say that in economic terms, the center left of the 1990s is to the right of the center right of the 1950s or 60s. This pattern also plays out in England, France, Italy, Germany, and many others. So it isn't savior leaders, it's this pressure from below. Then an interesting thing with this pressure from below was I wondered, well, is it these great figures from history? You know, Martin Luther King, for example, or Rosa Parks, whose birthday it is today, 108th birthday it would be today. And that Montgomery bus boycott story we sometimes learn as Rosa Parks refused to stand, Rosa Parks sat, and Martin Luther King spoke, and victory came. That isn't what happened. And when I looked back at the history, I found it was really about organizing. For 2 years before Rosa Parks sat down, Rosa Parks was a trained organizer and activist who studied at a place called the Highland Folk School that learned from Scandinavian trade union and small farmer activism. But for 2 years before that, she did that, a group of African-American women were planning this. And for 1 year after they did it, in fact, for longer than a year, for about 380 days, they had to maintain this boycott. And that, a lot of it came down to logistics. They had to work with the postman to plot exactly how people would get to work. They had to work with every single Black church in order that they would do it. Diane Nash, the civil rights leader, said the whole of Montgomery did this, not one leader. Interestingly, Martin Luther King himself said, I did not lead this, I did not conceive it. I came because they asked me to come and help. So when I looked back at the story of movements, again, that wasn't the individual hero, it was the leaderful set of heroes. Now, this pattern that I found, and I've just touched briefly on the US example, but I found that as well in Latin America in the 2000s. This is the only very recent example of inequality being reduced is in a bunch of Latin American countries for about a decade or a decade and a half in the 2000s. And then the much bigger, very, very international example is in what's called the long mid-20th century that ends in about 1970 something. And it's a huge amount of countries. So it's the US, it's Europe, but it's also the newly independent African and Asian countries from the 50s or 60s, depending on when they got independence, all pursued successfully reducing inequality, and all had some of that same pattern of the power of organizing from below. Just to take one example, Ghanaian independence happens not just as a campaign to replace white leaders with black leaders, English leaders with Ghanaian, but a principled approach about what society should be, about how society should be equal. And that is in part because it was driven by the trade unions, for example, of cocoa workers, that all the wealth from cocoa used to go to tiny people and to foreigners. After independence, because the cocoa and the other workers had organized, they got stronger workers' rights, stronger, better wages, not just for cocoa workers, but for everybody. And then when the Cocoa Marketing Board takes the wealth of making cocoa away from just this small handful to the society, initially to the workers, they get free school for every cocoa worker's kid. And then they start to make so much money with the Cocoa Marketing Board for the country that it then funds free school for every child across the country. So we see similar patterns of that in Zambia, in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, etc. So a really interesting set of models in developing countries in that long 20th century too, and then in Latin America in particular in the 21st, very first part of the 21st century. And the same mix. What is the same mix? You seem to need to do these three things. Firstly, you need to be willing to get into trouble. A lot of people think that movements should not be too difficult, or that if someone's saying a movement is difficult, that it's messing up. Now, I remember just a few years ago, people used to say, Black Lives Matter is so divisive. Why can't they be more like Martin Luther King? Well, in 1966, 63% of Americans said that Martin Luther King was divisive. The suffragettes, who only said that women should get the vote, were called dangerous by the New York Times. In fact, so were the anti-slavers, or the radical anti-slavers, as the New York Times called them. So whenever you start a movement, you will get into what Congressman John Lewis called good trouble. Every single social movement's done that. Second lesson seems to be this: you need to organize. You'll never be powerful on your own. This somewhat goes against what sometimes we think about when we think about career chats, which is that it's about my development, me, how will I assert? But what I found, and it's again, in a way unsurprising, middle-class people, just like working class people, do not change things on their own. They can only change things in concert with others. So the people that have helped to bring about more equal societies have formed groups, trade unions, faith-based groups, women's groups, activist groups, and then they've joined those groups together in what the Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign calls fusion coalitions, groups of groups. And the third is this, that you need to go beyond a policy conversation and have a conversation about values, a narrative conversation. Interestingly, the phrase welfare state emerged in England not from any politician or intellectual, but from the Archbishop of Canterbury, from a religious figurehead, who was looking at the damage of war and saying, how do we build a society that's more loving, that's more caring? That all the successful social movements that reduced inequality had song and art and moral foundation. They did not just list, these are the 5 or 6 policies that we seek to make. We need to get away from that policy obsessive focus. It was wonderful to see how with the movie Roma, I hope you've seen the movie Roma, brilliant Mexican movie about the life of a domestic servant. Now, that movie helped to tip over the edge in Mexico legislation that strengthens the rights of domestic workers for the first time ever in that country. And yet that movie contains 0 policy recommendations, 0. But what it did was it energized a nation, it energized society to such an extent that it was able to push even some legislative change. So that part about narrative is key. Now, I don't argue in the book that if you do all these things, you'll win. I quote a famous line that many of you who have connections in Latin America or in Spanish-speaking countries will know. They say the people united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated. And what I found is that actually that's not true. The people united are often defeated. But what is true is this: the people divided are always defeated. And so though resistance doesn't always work, acceptance always doesn't work. So I don't come up with a recipe that guarantees success. But what I think I've been able to articulate in the book, based on talking with people who were there, talking with people who did it, and talking with people who are trying to do it again today, are three things that seem to be core to all the times it has been won. So if you want to be part of fighting inequality, you're still going to face many defeats. But when we look back at our past, we can not only get inspiration that, yes, it can be done, we can also get some really useful lessons bequeathed by our ancestors and by people who are fighting now about how we might do so. And that's it for my intro. And I'd love really to open it to a conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Ben, for an amazing introduction. And again, I'm not through the book, but I'm enjoying every word. So please read it and recommend it to others. A little bit of promotion there. And maybe it can become a New York Times bestseller, and then Ben can have figure out how to increase advocacy. So I'll start with the first question, then Kata. I have 10 million, but I will just keep it to one. And then please feel free to start putting your questions in the chat and/or raise your hand. So Ben, my question is on careers. And so, I was professor at Georgetown for 10 years. I still teach. We only had one labor organizer out of all the time I was there who was a labor organizer, did the degree and continued labor organizing. Some people went into impact investing, other people went to work for oil companies, other people went to diplomacy. But my question is, I don't think we help educate and train people enough on organizing and advocacy skills in any institution of higher education. So if someone wants to work on addressing inequality, whether it's through advocacy, policy, organizing, what skills do you think they need to develop? And is that through formal education, or is it best just to go out and learn, through doing and in partnership with others? And where are the careers for people who want to address, inequality is one of the most challenging global issues, because if we don't get this right, we're not going to have a planet, so where do you see the growth in careers where people can affect strong change without giving up their ethics?
That's a great question, and there's so many different parts to it. And I'm going to distinguish between advocacy and organizing. Advocacy is really about how do I represent to government or to powerful people. Organizing is about how do I build the bonds with others in order that we strengthen our power so that we're listened to. Jay Naidu, who ran the trade union movement in South Africa that helped defeat apartheid, he said to me, Ben, they didn't care how good our argument was. What they cared about was the strength of us versus them. So he said, no one topples power with a PowerPoint is Jay's phrase. So organizing is really key. Now, it's interesting because you can think about great schools for people who want to change the world through business, right? You've got the Harvard Business School or Said Business School in Oxford, and various others have followed. You can also think about great schools of government for people who want to change the world by doing policy, either by being in government or by talking to government, like the Kennedy School, etc. Here's what you can't find very much: schools of organizing. It's interesting, isn't it? When I look back and I looked at what was the most transformational thing, why don't we teach it? I mean, I think partly we don't teach it because it is transformational, but there are some places that do. Trade unions do. People like MSF, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, MST, they have a school, in fact, just outside of Sao Paulo, and they try and teach organizing. I spent some wonderful days, and peace folks will know this place, the King Center in Atlanta. And some people come to King because he's such a powerful moral voice for peace and for justice and for love. But I really got so excited about another King, another part of King, which is there's so much in King about organizing and about how you strengthen the power of collectives. And in a way, we get so blown away with his rhetoric and with his moral philosophy that we actually lose what an amazing organizer he is. And so I think spending time at the King Center in Atlanta is also a wonderful way to learn. So there are some places that do so, but I think it is very much an underplayed skill. I think partly you can do it by, for example, in your workplace, is there a trade union? If so, join it. If there isn't, can you make one happen? In your local neighborhood, I think sometimes people distinguish, they think about changing the world as something that they do in their work. And then sometimes people will say, I'm a community development advisor, for example, and then you'll say to them, who lives next door? And they go, I've got no idea. You think, well, how about building some community at home? Organize your own place too. So I think people can learn some of those skills in what they do as a citizen and what they do as a member of a community. One of the things that I learned in my career was I think that I made a mistake. I was very fortunate in I got to do a lot of things very young and got very senior. And sometimes if you're a senior person in an NGO, and particularly if you're a white man, British passport, working for a big name NGO, etc., it can become very easy to start to imagine, because people are deferential, that you're the one with the answers. And I remember being very struck when I saw this amazing piece of organizing and advocacy by some friends in Nairobi. My friend showed me his half house. I used to live in Nairobi just before we moved to Rome. When I say his half house, this is why it's a half house. Thugs were sent by the people that were renovating this slum, claiming that they were building better houses for the poor. They were building better houses for the middle classes and the rich, throwing out the poor. The people that were doing it didn't even send the cops to beat up the people. They just sent thugs, local guys who they paid money to smash things up. They were smashing the people and they were smashing the buildings, physically knocking down their shacks. And they only managed to knock down half of his. So he's got half. You can see the moment where it stopped. It's kind of preserved, the moment where it stopped. So I said, how did you do it? He said, well, the World Bank says that in order to move someone from their slum for a World Bank funded program, you need consent. So the World Bank makes people sign, those developers, they make people sign, and the government who borrows the money, that they will not move people without consent. This is obviously unconsensual. It's physical, violent move and destruction. Now, I know, he says, that the World Bank doesn't really mean that. But I also knew that if we embarrass them, if we put it in their faces, then what could they do? So I said, what did you do? You called them up? He said, no. I took photos and videos whilst these guys were doing it, right? And bear in mind, he's in physical danger as this is happening. I took photos and videos and I put them on Twitter and I tagged at World Bank, you're funding these guys. And they phoned me, right? And then they called up the government and the government stopped it. They stopped it in the middle of smashing this guy's house. And I'm like, this is amazing. Like I've worked on advocacy and influencing for 20 something years. I work with teams of the most senior professionals. I've never seen a plan as clever as this that has impact in like 40 minutes through a chain of understanding power and influence. I said, how on earth did you do that? How on earth did you come up with that idea? And he said, Ben, we've got nowhere else to live. And that was one of those moments of what I call unlearning, when I was just reminded that actually, and this is really where it touches the question of career, it has never really been the professionals that have changed the world. It's always been the amateurs. So young people said to me, there's no justice, there's just us. But then we talked about how that phrase, which is true and can sound very down, there's actually great hope when you realize that just us organized is incredibly powerful. So I think that what I then, as I reflect on my role as a professional, is that I need as a professional to be an accompanier, an enabler, and someone whose work isn't just about how does someone's material deprivation be tackled, but how do I help them in their quest, not only to tackle a specific material deprivation, but to become more powerful, so that then the series of deprivations that they face of material and of voice, they can tackle. And in a way, that's success. And so I have tried to try to kind of adapt what I do as a professional to be someone whose work is not just saying the problem is this person's deprivation, how do I talk to the power holder about this person's deprivation, but rather how do I help change the relationship between those two? And one way to change it is to help that person in their quest to strengthen their own power collectively. So that I think that's the interface between the organizing and advocacy, but I hope it's also a kind of interface between what we see our role as professionals and how we both complement that with our own personal citizenry, but also how we learn to be a seconder. There's a phrase in drama, and a theologian reminded me of it at Notre Dame. A priest came up to me and he said, "Ben, we need to learn to be deuteragonists." A lot of people never heard that word, but if you heard the word protagonist, protagonist means the main guy. Deuteragonist is the second, the buddy. And I think that as professionals, we are most impactful when we're that deuteragonist, that buddy.
I don't know you guys, but I want to stay here for like 5 hours just listening to you. This is the most exciting Zoom meeting I've had since the pandemic. I'm having like real aha moments every like 3 to 15 seconds. And because we have already 3 or 4 questions, I have they always let me ask a question. So I'm going to use my chance. And it's an impossible one, but it follows what you were saying and it's burning. So you were talking about like the conditions that you have studied around 3 conditions in which you have experienced inequality improvement. And so I can't help but think right now in the United States where we are, you have the Black Lives Matter, you have the poverty, the pandemic, and you have the new administration. And I know it's a lot to ask to the new president of the US, but do you see here a historical opportunity and the right conditions for the at least tackling of inequality, or are we going to have just another democratic run-of-the-mill administration? I mean, and as I said, it's impossible to answer because it's about the future.
Yeah, no, I do see it. I do see an opportunity, but I think that there's often a debate about what's going to happen in America, and there's 2 arguments put forward, and I'm going to put them forward, and then I'm going to say why I think they're both wrong. So one argument says this. One argument says, it's so exciting because Joe Biden's this kid from Scranton, this poor working class kid, Irish Catholic, simple guy, one of the least wealthy senators when he was in power. And then Kamala Harris, the first Black woman vice president. She's got Jamaican ancestry, Indian ancestry. She knows what it's like to be, oppressed. So she is going to lift everyone up. That's one discourse that, if you like, that's the official Democrat discourse. Another discourse goes like this. They're going to sell us out. They're the old school. Because our person didn't win our preferred candidates didn't win the primary, and because actually Joe is the guy from Delaware, which is a tax haven, and Kamala was a prosecutor, put people in prison for smoking dope. We can't trust them. We can't trust them. They're going to betray us. So both of those approaches put all of the authority into those 2 and say everybody else is just a spectator in this process. And they say, isn't it a shame we've got no one like FDR? FDR, like I said, amazing in government, an aristocrat. There's a lovely picture that came out recently, of because it was FDR's birthday and it was him dressed up in his kilt by his grandfather. It looked absolutely ridiculous. Is all poshly dressed up. He didn't know what life was like for ordinary people. And though when he first came into office, he brought with him some really radical people in a group called the Brains Trust. They lost all the policy debates in that first year, and the old Treasury hawks kept winning, and the country was on its knees. And it was when people started to pressure the government that change happened. The same when you look at people like Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy sat with Black leaders, a couple of weeks before, and he just didn't get why they were protesting before some of the big marches. He kind of didn't get what the problem was, or why they couldn't wait. So the past leaders who delivered transformative change didn't deliver it because their biography said that they would. They delivered it because they were pressured to do so. So I think we talk too much about the people who were up on the main stage. In India, they call it the dice. And there's this kind of idea that, you know, it's the people on the main stage who are the people that make history. We make history. So do I have hope for America, for example? Yes, but why? Because of the Poor People's Campaign, that because of the Fight for 15 movement for the minimum wage, because of Black Lives Matter, and because Black Lives Matter is not only fighting the murdering young Black boys, but is also fighting the policy violence of how Black people and all working class people are held back by inequitable policy, because of the climate kids, and because the climate kids are not just trying to save the planet, but are trying to push for a Green New Deal that means wonderful jobs, that means that those industrial workers are not going to be the victims of a climate revolution, but are going to be the key beneficiaries of a climate revolution, because of the feminist activists, because of rising trade union activism that means, for example, certain industries, experts said, could never be organized. Some people say you can only organize in a factory where everyone meets each other. And if you've got something like Uber, where you're not really together, you can't organize them. Uber guys organized, and they're winning victories. Lyft guys are organizing, Deliveroo guys are organizing, and they're winning victories. And together they're putting the pressure. So my hope is in them. And I generalize that to the world as well. I'd say that where we have a cause for optimism, it is not because the person in charge is going to take us in a new direction. It's because ordinary people will. We've got our colleague from South Africa here, both in my own life, but then in the book, as I look back and I study the South African case, you saw a classic mistake that was made in 1994. And the mistake was this: the good guys won, and people assumed that now the good guys, now the monsters of apartheid had been defeated and Saint Nelson Mandela was in power, now everything would be fine. And those who had been organizing to pressure government were told, you don't need to do that anymore. Just become a minister, just come into government. So the NGOs, the trade unions, everyone was told, pressure is off. Now it's access. Now you're in. Now we run the machinery of government. And anybody continuing to cause trouble is now a counter-revolutionary who's now trying to harm the project of self-government. What that led to was that actually inequality continued to increase even after apartheid. So that a generation after apartheid, when there were kids becoming adults who hadn't been born, you know, before Mandela was president, the kids then turning 18, 19 in a less equal society than the one that they had been born into. Who were the successful movements in South Africa? Treatment Action Campaign, who forced the government to deliver the largest single ARV program in the world. And then later on, students, first in Rhodes Must Fall, attacking colonial systems of education, then in Fees Must Fall, attacking the price of education. And what those movements have in common was that they were undeferential. They got into good trouble. They didn't say, our uncle freed us, we must listen obediently. They were obstreperous and difficult. And that is how change is meant. So I really hope, whether it's in the States or in everywhere, that as much as we can feel love when the fascists are thrown out and when decent, competent people get into office, as much as we can celebrate that, we can't stop pressuring them. And in fact, if they want to be transformative figures, they should want that pressure, because the historical record is that unpressured people deliver no transformation.
Thanks, Ben. So we have so many questions coming in, so just jump into it. Pusaletto asked a question where you talked about MLK and Martin Luther King, and he was a big advocate of reparations. And so Pusaletto would like to know, in societies that have extremely high inequality and are incredibly racialized, like US or South Africa or lots of other places that have had institutionalized racism, both in policy, law, and culture, what is your opinion of reparations helping to reduce and change that?
I think it's good. I'll give an example of the States. The average white family, and there's a huge differentiation amongst white families and amongst black families, but the mean average white family has $100,000 of wealth. That's money left over after you've paid your mortgage, et cetera, et cetera. The average black family has $10,000 of wealth. That's no cushion at all. I mean, you could, if you know, needing to fix your house, or needing to deal with a vehicle, or needing to deal, you know, especially in the States context with a catastrophic health emergency, would wipe all of that out. So the average black family really has no cushion, and so the story that's told is, oh well, if you just, you know, get a good education, you know, you're okay, is just not true. And so that big wealth gap needs to be tackled. I would emphasize the need to complement that with a bunch of other policies, some of which are race specific, like action to tackle inequality, or actions to tackle previous historical discrimination, and action for affirmative action, and the various federal policies that can do that. So you need a bunch of social and economic policies, which will narrow the economic gap, and which will generally benefit more black families than white families, but will benefit all. In fact, will benefit the majority of people. So things like taking away the costs of higher education, which is eminently possible. Loads of countries in Europe have completely free university education. Americans kind of believe it can't be done, but yes, it can. And free healthcare. Because without free healthcare, effectively taxing people in a regressive way, and you're leaving people in absolute fear of death or bankruptcy, and unable to take risks. So you need to do some of those things, as well as a kind of literal financial reparations. So you need the package. It's interesting that if you look at if you go on the web and look at Movement for Black Lives, and you look at what they advocate for, what I found interesting was that they talk about police violence, obviously and rightly they talk about reparations. They also talk about some of these other policies as well, and I think it's that package that can start to redress some of these injustices.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Ruth from Vienna, who worked at the OSC for a long time. She would like to know, what are some useful resources in supporting groups fighting inequality? You know, so civil rights and human rights defenders, anti-corruption, gender. She mentions one resource, the Resilience Fund, but I guess, like, has anyone compiled the Fight Inequality Alliance or others? Because one thing you talk about is, you know, people, when they organize and they hold power accountable, change can happen, but also power often fights back and injures, hurts, jails, kills people. So like, what are the key resources to help people both understand the strategy, but also keep themselves protected and safe?
Those are really good. And I guess in resources, you're talking about two types. One is a kind of financial, and the other is a kind of learning one. The financial is really quite tight. Not many do this. And when there was a bit of a shift amongst some donors to recognize the inequality challenge, still many of them focused on treating it as a policy challenge. So rather than treating it as an imbalance of power and a need to help organizing, I think that there are, you know, people like OSF have always had an approach around organizing, which I think is really positive and exciting and exceptional. Amongst some institutional donors, people like the Dutch have always seen the importance of a strong and pluralist civil society in and of itself, but also as an instrument to delivering effective governance. So there are some, but they're few. The positive side of this, though, is that actually some of the most effective organizing either doesn't cost very much, or it's self-financed. And so you have, on the one hand, people will say, well, you know, my project doesn't have the resources to organize people. And then you find that people have either formed, you know, their own social movement, women's groups, for example, or small farmers groups, or people have got together in a faith group, or people have got together in some type of trade union completely self-funded, or a neighborhood group like a slum dwellers association, completely self-organized and self-funded because it matters to them. Generally, if you start with the financial resources question, you're probably asking the wrong question. In terms of resources about where to learn from, I think the thing I would encourage people to look at is not just to look at the policy mix to tackle inequality, but look at the social mix to enable that policy mix to become realizable. And so for people to look at where they can learn about organizing, and where near them or where online now in the COVID context they can learn about that. I said it in the book, at the end of the book in an appendix, a couple of places that try to do that. So you've got people like Beautiful Rising, people like Campaign Bootcamp. These are organizations that teach organizing. I mentioned the King Center, the Nonviolence 365 training. People like Fight 15 and Paul Booth's campaign in the States are doing this. They're training people in organizing. Look out for a local trade union that's trying not just to organize its own, but helping other unorganized groups. Look, those would be the places I'd encourage people to do. But a lot of where I've seen it work well, a lot of it really is people get into it not knowing exactly what they're going to do. They make lots of mistakes and they learn together how to do it. So I wouldn't want people to hold on doing it until they're good at it. Generally, you get good at it by starting bad at it.
So we have now 7 minutes and an equal amount of questions. So let's get on to it. So interesting, both your questions and also your answers, Ben. This is from Cristina in Italia about trade unions. I think it's a very pertinent question. You mentioned its effectiveness and ability to create and affect change. And she wonders whether that's true. Still, the trade unions have the ability to drastically change the job market, as in her experience in Italy, she would not say that's the case.
So the argument is not that trade unions, always as they are effective instruments. The argument is rather that if you look at when a country has been able to reduce inequality, what's called trade union density, which in other words is membership of a trade union, is high. And when trade union density becomes low, inequality goes up. So unorganized people are weak. Now, there's two alternatives to trade unions who some people might feel are not doing very well at a particular case. There's two alternatives. One is work to fix and improve and strengthen trade unionism, challenge it on internal democracy, help to strengthen those who are particularly unorganized sectors. Trade unions now tend to be stronger amongst, say, formal sector workers and less amongst informal. Can you work on that? That's one approach. The other is to say, well, we just won't unionize. We won't have unions. They belong in the factory era. We will just, I'll just bargain. Me and Bezos will argue about what's a fair contract. Or what's a fair contract at Amazon is that people piss in their pants because they're not given toilet breaks. And so no one's found a way in which I, as an individual, can negotiate with a boss that doesn't have that. So it's not to say that unions are working, it's to say we haven't found a way to make it work without making them work. And the other part about trade unions is that not only do they impact at the workplace, but the societies with strong trade union presence also impact the policy mix. So I'm not romantic about their current state. It's just to say that yeah, if we don't have them, then we're very, very weak.
And here is a different question from Naomi, different topic. You talked about and you listed a series of policies which governments can implement to reduce inequality. Could you please share your thoughts on global governance, global government?
So there are some things that we need an international dimension for, And whether that's regional or global. So regional meaning like African Union or European Union, or global meaning the UN and things. So if you take something like climate, you obviously need a UN process, but also for tackling tax avoidance, you need a UN process. For some other processes, African Union stronger integration can be really helpful, for example. Those international governance mechanisms are really they're just forms of power, a bit like a country, state government. So though I'm an internationalist, and though the historical record is that, ultranationalism takes us nowhere, there's nothing intrinsically benign about international power. We see right now, for example, on medicines, this notion of intellectual property that says that it would be a crime for me to save your life from getting COVID by using a recipe for a COVID medicine that belongs to another company. It would be a crime. It'd be a crime even for a government to save the lives of its own citizens. And South Africa and India have asked for a waiver on that exemption, and all the rich countries are blocking them. So the way that on medicines, intellectual property, that's bizarrely run out of a trade agreement rather than out of a health agreement, that's an immensely damaging form of international governance. The record of the IMF has been immensely internationally damaging. What the European Union did to Greece was obscene. If you study economic contractions, the biggest economic contraction ever is Greece, and it's the only one that was deliberately caused. The Wall Street crash and the crisis after the First World War were accidents, were failures. But the Greece crash was deliberate policy. And so there's nothing intrinsically good about what institutions will do at any level, whether national or regional or global, but we do need all of them if we're going to be effective. But what we need is a relationship with them where they're forced to listen to us more and listen to the powerful and the rich less.
Thank you, Ben. So I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question, which is asking about the recent military coup in Myanmar or Burma. And also yes. just in general, at least for the past 5 or 6 years, there has been a return to strongmen. If you think yes. about like the 80s and early 90s, it was like strong men in power, maybe 1 or 2 women. And, it seems like at least the upswing has been strong men, dictatorship, and military power. So what do you see as the potential for people power, in this kind of global environment, and how that relates to inequality?
Sure. And we see 2 types of strong men, because we also see strong men who get into power with their public support. Netanyahu, Duterte, and Bolsonaro. And there's a connection also between ultranationalism, misogynism, and economic inequality. Fascists do better in economic crises. It's not a coincidence that 1929 led to 1933. It's absolutely causal. And in this crisis that we're in COVID, there's a real risk. There's a potential for us, because now status quo is out the door, the potential for those of us who want to change society dramatically to win. But fascists want to change society dramatically too, and there's a potential for them. There's another type of strongman, which is more like the Myanmar version that's just come into power again through dictatorship. I think though there's some lessons really for us in how change happens. Far too much, and I was one of them. I mean, I used to have all of her books. Far too much faith was put in the idea that the lady, Aung San Suu Kyi, would deliver for the people, because her father was the great patriot, because she is so articulate and beautiful and so much a charismatic figure. Now, she failed, and she even failed to stand up for the very basic decent idea that burning people alive because they're a different faith is bad. And the was a massive error of all of us in the international community, but also of the Burmese movement, for focusing so much on one person. What we needed was stronger organizing from below. We need a strong citizenry. We cannot put our faith in saviors. It always goes wrong. And it was kind of tragic to watch it happen with Aung San Suu Kyi, both in terms of how she failed to deliver for her country, and in terms of, not just in terms of tackling inequality, but that basic fundamental human right, the basic standard that genocide is a never again. But then that she left herself in such a situation with the military, where really all that they've done is reveal the hidden hand, that in a way they were always in charge, with the 25% block in parliament and a 75% majority needed to overcome that 25% block. They were always in charge, and all they did was they just took the curtain off the show. But a real transformation in Burma or anywhere is not about our hero, the hero on our t-shirt, getting into the palace. Real transformation is when we become more powerful together. We got that horribly wrong in Burma, and sadly, what's happened is just 100% predictable and was predicted. And I hope that we'll start smaller and more grassroots there, but also that everywhere people will remember that lesson.
Thank you.
The saddest thing is that we run out of time, but not of content and knowledge and questions. And sadly, the folks that connect from Africa probably have to go to bed or have dinner. Some of us here in the Western Hemisphere a little bit earlier, but it's time for us to go, and this is hard. The good news is that you have written it and you have a book that we can all go and continue, because you left us all so inspired. And I learned so much in this Zoom session that I even liked, which now all of us, if we connect to Zoom, is an act of love, I guess, because we're Zoomed out. But this was so worth it. Everyone in the PCDN community thanks you, Ben. And people, next Thursday, we will try. The bar has risen pretty high, but we'll try and bring another amazing professional. Tomorrow we have another podcast episode. Ben, thank you so much for teaching. And I'm just want to leave you with a phrase you taught me, is let us all go and make good trouble. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. And everybody, tweet me your stories or tweet me your questions and keep the dialogue going. Take care.
Thank you so
Good
much.
trouble,
Ben.
everyone.
Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Ciao.
Make good trouble.